Morning, everybody. Thank you so much for your patience. I'm Susan Aaronson, and I direct the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub at George Washington University. And today we are so pleased and honored to welcome EU Parliamentarian Bernd Lange. And before I introduce him, I'd really like to thank his staff, Laura van de Putte, who went out of her way to help facilitate this webinar. And so I'd also like to thank our sponsors at the Center for International Governance Innovation, the Internet Society, GW Cyber, GW Institute for International Economic Policy, and my colleagues at the Hub. So EU Parliamentarian Lange is from Germany, and he directs the Committee on International Trade. And so what we will do is, as we always do, which is I'll ask him some questions, and then we'll leave the bulk of time for your questions, which I will read out loud to him. So we welcome you to put your questions in the chat, and we look forward to hearing them. So good afternoon, Parliamentarian Lange. So let's start with this question. The EU has done more than any other country or trade bloc to govern data at the national and international level. Could you briefly describe the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, and talk about how these rules may serve as a model for other countries' approaches to data governance?
Thanks a lot, first, for the invitation. And beside being the chair of the International Trade Committee, I'm also responsible for the trade relation with the United States. So I'm quite close to the development in the United States as well. Before coming to the two legislation you asked for, let me raise 4 points so that you have an understanding what's about. First point, I think digitalization is a coin with two sides. On the one side, we have really a lot of positive possibilities because of digitalization. And also regarding AI, a lot of new possibilities, monitoring work is gone, and so on. But the second side of the coin, of course, is that digitalization can also lead to manipulation, to undermining of democratic structures, to raise just for the short-time profit and not respecting the interests of the people in the ground. So this is a two-side coin issue, and this has to be reflected as we reflect the use of technology in the analog sphere as well. Second remark, inside the European Union, we have a clear commitment that the right, the ownership on personal data is a fundamental right. That's a little bit different to other other countries worldwide, but this led also to the data protection regulation, this new standard for the protection of data, of personal data, and which has also some consequences to our discussion about data management in the United States. So we are really keen to make clear that the ownership and the responsibility for the dates, the personal dates, the date of birth, or the health state, or whatever, is by the person created this data. Third remark, the digital area is a global area. So digital sphere knows no borders. And we are also profiting about this situation. So an engineer in Australia can work during night, and next day you can produce something in Europe. Or the car industry is really a borderless supply chain network. So therefore, our ambition is also to look to the international dimension of the digital area. And fourth remark, we have a global imbalance on the platform economy. It's really, really great. Just to remind you that just seven IT companies have around about 70% of the global market share of platforms. 7 companies, 70% of the market share, and 90 countries from Africa, from Latin America, have a market share on platform from 1.2%. So there is a really imbalance, and the power is really in the hand of a few companies. And having these 4 remarks in our mind, then it's clear that there is a discrepancy between the analog sphere and the digital sphere. On the analog sphere, we have a lot of regulation inside the European Union on competition law, similar, by the way, you have in the United States, so the antitrust legislation, for example, or the question of protection against manipulation, the consumer rights, and so on. On the digital sphere, we have more or less Wild West. And perhaps you can explain it with the development of the digital sphere, but it's also linked a little bit to the attitude of the creator of this digital world. You can find a lot of quotes from people in Silicon Valley saying this is totally different from the analog world. We have the freedom there, and we need no regulation, and we need just voluntary commitments, and we can do our business ourselves. And this is, I guess, not true. The reality is that, of course, the digital sphere is intervening in the analog sphere, and we need proper regulation as well. And therefore, after a long discussion inside the European Union, the Commission presented some pieces of legislation. By the way, not only pieces of legislation, but also a proposal 2 weeks ago. So the webinars really timely presented on a convention for digital rights, so that everybody can discuss what are the fundamental necessary to regulate in the digital sphere. Besides this declaration, some pieces of legislation on the table. On the one hand, and you referred to the DMA, the Digital Market Act. It has the clear target to prevent an anti-competitive behavior of big, large internet companies. So nobody should be forced to not to install an app from a smartphone. Nobody should be forced to just use only one system. And no company should be allowed ranking only their own products in front of third-party products in their research system. By the way, there are also some cases against some companies in the United States because of that. So, and therefore this legislation is now put on the table, and it's now in the European Parliament, and we decided in December on our position with a really, really broad majority for more than 600 votes out of 700. So we wanted to specifically look on the big companies, the so-called gatekeeper, who reached more than 10% of the people inside the European Union, which are around about 45 million people. I guess they have a specific responsibility, and they should really respect competition law in this digital sphere. And some other elements related to traditional competition law are also in this legislation, so that we don't like so-called killer accusations, so that in case of systematic non-compliance, companies should not be allowed to further damage the internal market and go in a really deep concentration. And as I mentioned, the possibilities to pre-installed applications are also part of the proposal. And of course, there are also some remedies concerning anti-competitive behavior foreseen. So it's a little bit related to some rulings of the European Court of Justice against some big companies which have had this anti-competitive behavior in the last year. This ruling of the Court of Justice, of course, is a possibility to guarantee competition, but it takes quite a long time, at least 8-9 years. And so therefore, I guess it's really important, similar to the analog sphere, where we have a quite clear competition law, state aid law. Is a little bit different to the United States. This has to be applied also in the digital area. And then the second legislation you mentioned is the Digital Service Act. This is an act which, based on an old legislation from 2000, the e-commerce regulation, which should guarantee the, let's say, fundamental rights of consumers in the social media platforms and on online marketplaces. Content of this legislation is that social media platforms and online marketplaces could forced to move illegal content, not as a responsibility by themselves, so they are not responsible for illegal content, fake news, or whatever, but it has to be transparent who is responsible for this content. So the principle, the know your business customer, is in this legislation, and I guess that's really relevant. I'm totally against that a big platform company should be playing the sheriff for the content of a platform, but they have the responsibility to make clear who puts this content in, and this should be the responsible person should be reachable. Then, of course, the question of targeted ads is also a relevant one. We had a discussion: should we really forbid this, because it is linked to the profiling of personal data? And Susan at the end of the day, we agreed to limit this forbid of targeted ads to minors, because of course, targeted ads is the business case for a lot of companies, and therefore, I guess it has a relevance. But we should be careful for this profiling process behind, and we want to a clear limitation to sensitive personal data, such as political, religious beliefs, and sexual orientations. That should be not in the basket of this profiling. And then are some other elements, so that if you give once a clear message that you want specific items not on your screen, that is not necessary that the pop-up comes again and again, and this in a more automated way, so that this so-called dark patterns really undermine your will, which you made clear once. So this two pieces of legislation, this was also adopted by the European Parliament in January, also with a huge majority. And both pieces of legislation are now in the negotiation process with the Council, and hopefully we will finish quite soon these two legislations as really guidance for similar laws we have in the analog sphere for the digital sphere. And yes, this has to be a global standard, similarly to the data protection legislation, which is now a global standard, because, as I mentioned at the beginning, the digital sphere is not knowing any borders, and we want also not create with the European legislation disadvantages. So we will really discuss this piece of legislation with counterparts, also with the United States. And last remark, it's really an advantage that we have the Trade and Technology Council, and we have the working group 4 and 5, which is dealing exactly with these items. And I think we should really try to cooperate to make clear who is the dominant force in the internet sphere. Is it the power of the company, or the right of the individual person? You have to unmute.
Thank you very much for that answer. Let me ask briefly about one other piece of legislation, the AI Act. Could you just describe briefly how you see the EU's approach to regulating AI, and where you see that the US and the EU might find common ground? Obviously, they found common ground on the global partnership for AI, but where else might we find common ground in terms of regulating the spillover effects of AI?
Yes, Susan, this is really a crucial point and a really good question, because for me personally, this AI regulation is the most important piece of legislation, because with AI, of course, the risk of manipulation, the risk of undermining democratic structures to divide society is really vital. And therefore, we have to look how to regulate AI. On the other hand, of course, there are a lot of advantages, no doubt about it. We can really score behavior of countries. We can guide people to through the streets. You find a marketplace, but on the other hand, you can. There's also a big risk of misuse AI, and therefore, in this regulation, we have some horizontal elements and some sector-specific approaches. And this legislation is based on a deep impact assessment. You asked at the beginning about studies. There is a big study about AI, and this study I will not refer in detail, but give a clear message which question have to be answered so that AI can be used in a proper way. And one of the key elements is of course that the human oversight is really needed for an AI system and the AI performance. This is in Article 14 of the Act, which is on the table, and quite practical. So the use of an algorithmus in a decision-making process for a job application, for example, can't be really relying just on a machine, on an algorithmus. The decision has to be transparent and oversight by a human being. And of course, other human beings have to be need the possibilities to influence this process as well. For example, works council in this respect. So this is a key element. The human oversight is needed. And then, of course, we also have some specific requirements regarding high-risk AI systems, so error-free and the composition, pipapo, and then also some general elements for AI, so that, for example, in motion recognition or biometric categorization are only possible if there is a clear information about that. By the way, this kind of AI is also covered by our dual use regulation and is not allowed to export to specific countries, because this information and democratic control is in a lot of countries not given. And some specifics, the question of social scoring should be forbidden for public authorities and not for private ones. And this will be the discussion, I guess. And then on the transparency. And this is also a link to the discussion with our US counterparts. Is an algorithm an IPR issue, or is the source code just the IPR issue? And to which extent we can have a transparency approach towards the algorithm. I guess in specific cases, the public authorities should have the right to look into the algorithm, that's for sure. But for the question if on which base an algorithm is really working, is it that some old wise men are creating the algorithm and by chance no gender balance is the outcome of the algorithm? This has to be proven. So I guess we will have a discussion how far transparency for an algorithm should be given. And this is, by the way, also a deep discussion between the United States and us, because it's also linked to business secrets, no doubt about. And this is also an item we are discussing during the e-commerce negotiations as WTO.
Thank you so much for that response. That's a good lead into the digital trade side. And I do hope there is more discussion about how trade secrets, their role in empowering very large corporations and getting greater control of data. I've seen very little scholarly work on that. Okay, so in terms of digital trade, and please, again, put your questions in the Q&A. We're going to start at 11:30 because we really want to open this to the audience. But let me ask one question. one thing about most trade agreements, including the EU, digital trade agreements say enforce your own law, and for consumer welfare, for privacy instead of personal data protection, and for spam. But such language discourages regulatory cooperation. How do you think digital trade agreements can add language that encourage not just cooperation, for example, on competition or on getting rid of spam or on disinformation, but how can you get an internationally accepted approach? Thank you.
So the best way, of course, would be that we have regulation and understanding at the WTO level. No? So there are a lot of requirements. You mentioned the privacy issue, but also the question of free data flow. So we have a tendency in the, to restrict data flow. We have at the moment more than 100 new data restriction in around about more than 60 countries. This, of course, harm the access to markets, the possibilities to a trade, but I guess is also not in the benefit for these countries. But of course, we have to respect some safety nets. And this is a crucial element in the negotiations. So the privacy, of course, it's clear. So I think data localization requirements for personal data are equivalently also in our bilateral trade agreements. But for the rest, the clear data flow mechanism should be established under the conditions we discussed before, that they are respected in an equivalent way. And we have with some countries also the equivalency agreement, for example, with Japan, so that data flow is given, and also the possibilities for data operations, because the requirements are really in an equivalent way designed than inside the European Union. On the e-commerce negotiation at WTO, at the moment we have 86 members negotiating, a lot of industrialized countries, also some developing countries, but there are also a lot of items now more or less finished, but the crucial discussion are indeed on the data localization issue, so that this is not a disadvantage to countries which are not belonging to this club of the 7 big companies. The question of the transparency in the algorithm is also an important issue, that of course there might be an oversight by the public authorities, that's for sure, but to what degree this algorithm can be made public is a point. And also the question of custom on data. At the moment we have an agreement since 1998 that moratorium for custom-free and tariff-free data exchange, but this is of course also not given as such. This has to be negotiated as well. So some developing countries and also UNCTAD are saying because of that a lot of revenue is going away. So 3 elements where the discussions are quite crucial at the moment, and let's see how this will go on for the next ministerial conference. But hopefully, as I mentioned, this would be the best solution if we really can establish a global regime, so that the restriction we are faced with can be overcome, but also on the other side, respecting the individual rights and privacy and the other necessary guidelines for the digital sphere.
I'm going to move to the questions right now. And so here's, I think, a very interesting question that one can only ask in the technology field. So regulation in the democracy takes a long time. But this questioner says, you know, on one hand, machine learning programs constantly evolve and update themselves. And the Internet of Things is going to involve 100 times more data. So it's very difficult to have personal data protection when the sensors involve a human being. How do we certify software when you have all these factors that are moving so much faster than regulation? Do you have a thought about that? Toughie.
Yeah, that's totally clear that the technology development is much faster than legislation can be. And therefore, I guess it's really important to create proper rules. As I mentioned before, the DSA, which is now on our table, is an update of a legislation from 2000. So between 2000 and now, of course, there are a lot of new developments, but the principles are quite similar, and now we are bring them in a horizontal way to the new situation, and that is crucial. I guess you can't regulate specific technologies. Sometimes in my discussion with some tech companies, they are going in this direction. So, Bernd, this horizontalism, this is not adequate to the technology progress. Let's focus on a specific problem and then make a regulation for that. This is the wrong way. So some fundamental principles like fair competition, like the human rights, like the stabilizing of democratic processes, this has to be regulated, and then I'm quite confident that this will find equivalence also in the technology development.
Thank you so much for that answer. Okay, we have another question. Well, there's actually 4 questions in this question, so I'm just going to concentrate on one of them, which is, this scholar who's asking the question says that laws to restrict online services assume that specific services that do not meet EU requirements can be controlled and blocked. Okay, just like the United States has sanctions right now on Pegasus and other threatening software. But we heard this morning that Pegasus was used in Hungary and Poland. So that sends the message that the EU can't even stop its members. So if the EU cannot get a consensus on the misuse of these technologies at home, how do we do this globally? What do you think?
So we had a revision of the so-called dual use regulation, so that we have a clear perspective for the export and the use of surveillance technology coming out of the European Union. And we have specific measures to prohibit the distribution to problematic countries worldwide. And a little bit similar to the United States, even in some extent, we are going further. And this is now in force since a few months. The problem you described in your question, of course, is not the use of such a software coming from the European Union in a third country, but using this software in a European country. And this is a big problem we have with 2 member states, where at the moment we are not sure that they are respecting the obligations of the European Treaty, the European values, and if this use of such a surveillance technology is also in line with undermining European law. And you can be sure that we are looking quite closely to this. Just today, I had a discussion with the French presidency of the Council about the respecting of the rule of law inside the European Union, and this is also even not the biggest one, but also an element of this exercise.
Thank you. It is such a toughie, because, and also given Poland and Hungary's status right now in the EU, it's of great concern. Okay, here's a question you probably anticipated. Could you update us on the status of the Privacy Shield, and do you see a solution soon?
So
Facebook's threats?
I would say we are negotiating. No, that's for sure that we can't really accept that without clear information. Public authorities have possibilities to look into private data. That's not acceptable. And we are really careful about this. You know, we agreed twice on a system for possible control, even inside the European Parliament. It was a little bit critical, specifically the first one. And we failed at the European Court of Justice twice. And you can imagine that at the moment, nobody will risk a system which might be failed a third time at the European Court of Justice. So it has to be crystal clear that our principles, so the ownership of the personal data is respected, and an oversight by whoever has to be under democratic control and with an information of the owner of the data. And this is a little bit complicated at the moment, but I can say the negotiations are going on, and I personally, I'm hopeful that we can find a solution during this year.
Goodness, I hope it comes soon. Okay, moving to a different topic, which I think once trade negotiators wake up to it, is going to be a lot of, it's going to cause a lot of problems. And that is the role of, certainly trade secrets should be used to protect algorithms. It would be very difficult to protect that under another approach to intellectual property. But trade secrets are not transparent, right? No one knows it, whether you're using a trade secret for that purpose. And trade secrets allow firms to control, unless the contract says differently, to control the reuse of the data, including personal data. Do you think that should lead trade negotiations to rethink the role of trade secrets in protecting algorithms? Does there need to be a rethink of that related to AI, XR, et cetera? It's a tough question.
Yeah. On the one hand, of course, the necessity to look also in trade secrets is there. On a different area, it's clear. For example, if you are going for anti-dumping measures, you have to look in the price building process of a product and on the distribution side and so on. So a lot of trade secrets are under control of the public authorities, specifically the European Commission. And there has to be a trust that this is not given to the competitors and not to a third country or something. And this, I guess, has to be doubled in the question of trade secrets in the data sphere as well, specifically regarding the algorithm. So If there is a reasonable doubt that the algorithm is really working in a proper way, in a non-discriminatory way, and I mentioned the different criteria, then I guess the public authorities have to have the right to look on that regarding the clear message. There is a trust that this will not lead to a distribution to everybody. It's a little bit tricky issue, but nevertheless, to respect the principles, the fundamental rights, the democratic structure, it is really necessary.
Thank you so much for that answer. Okay, here's another tough question. Do you think there is a connection between the EU's regulation of competition and the fact that few, if any, digital startups come from Europe? I actually think that's not true, that few digital startups come from, but big companies are not in Europe.
So I would not name Google as a startup. No. but I had a discussion with a congressman 2 or 3 years ago, and he named more or less Google as a startup. This small companies, and they were economically successful, and now you will regulate them, and because you have no such companies in Europe. That's not true. Because, as I mentioned, the big gatekeepers are the the US companies, and of course TikTok coming from China as well. Specifically regarding the Service Act and also regarding AI, a lot of small and medium-sized companies are covered because specifically in AI, a lot of opportunities and possibilities are created by a startup. And in Hamburg, there was now opened last week information center about AI and the possibilities of AI, and you will see there a lot of small companies presenting their solutions of AI. So that is not really an anti-US activity we are faced with. By the way, we have also some bigger companies like SAP and some others, which are also covered by the legislation. So no, this is not an attack against US companies. And by the way, there are also some discussion about the behavior and of these companies inside the Congress. I'm also aware about that.
Thank you so much for that answer. Okay, Oscar has a question that is dear to the Hub's heart, because Oscar is interested in the role of the public and how you involve the public in data governance and data policies. Could you talk a little bit about the challenges that the European Parliament faces in mobilizing the public to care about these issues? And just citing a statistic, for example, right? EU citizens care deeply about personal data protection, and yet they seem to be a growing market for Facebook, which is declining in many other countries. What's up with that? I'm signaling that, you know, many people believe Facebook doesn't do such a good job of personal data protection. So I shouldn't have signaled one country, but
it is a little bit growing. Huh? You're quite right that for a longer time, this was really under the radar of civil society and even under the radar here in the European Parliament, if you understand. But step by step, it is now in the debate. Just last week, I had a discussion about the question, human being or algorithm. So what is the driving force of our democratic society? And this question, by the way, it is a continuous discussion also under philosophic theory, in this philosophic theory, which negative effects progress might bring with. And in this digital issue, this discussion was not so focused so far, but it is growing also in the dialogue with civil society, because the problems are really now on the table. The question of building bubbles which are really focusing on fake news and impose a different kind of public awareness, which is undermining our democratic process, bringing different people together, discussing and deciding in a democratic way. And some elements of this movement you saw in the United States on the 6th of January. We saw it now here in Europe regarding the vaccination and the enemies of the vaccination process. These are processes which are linked to a undemocratic structure of some social media and some platforms. And secondly, it has also changed the possibilities. They are much easier. Now, back to AI. So we have a lot of surveillance cameras also in our homes. So just looking if there is coming a thief into our rooms. But now we have more than 100 apps. With them you can change a quite stupid civilian camera into an intelligent one. So looking, is your corona mask right placed? If there are some emotions to see, and a lot of different items based on this app for such a stupid surveillance camera. And this, quite cheap and new developments lead also a stronger discussion inside the parliament and civil society. And once again, the proposal by the Commission now to discuss a fundamental rights declaration is a result about this awareness about problems with the digital age. So the principle for digital aid, and this will lead really to a big discussion. At the end of the day, these principles will be declared by Parliament, Commission, Council, and now we are collecting the different perspectives from different stakeholders. And of course, everybody is invited to take part in this process, but it's really important that we have a clear vision of the democratic principle in the digital age.
Totally agree. Could you talk a bit, an anonymous questioner has said that given that you're trying to limit the use of targeted ads, do you see the EU as actually going after the whole business model of surveillance capitalism? In other words, that business model might be inherently flawed by providing free services based on the reuse of personal data and using prediction models, et cetera, to sell to firms about us, because it undermines human autonomy and democracy, as you discussed earlier.
Yeah, but of course, I would now not changing the society and the business model of companies. So, of course, to maximize the revenue, the profit is the clear perspective. Of course, we are discussing a little bit if companies should not get also an obligation for sustainability. We will have pieces of legislation on due diligence for companies coming quite soon. So that is a little bit change of this ultra-free business model. But in principle, I guess this is also the motivation for innovation. And therefore, it is important to set the rules so that in the frame of rules, you can do your business. And I guess you have also some certainty about the rules which have long standing for several years. And so in these rules, in this framework, you can do your business. And of course, some of the items you mentioned are quite out of the set of rules, that's for sure.
I'm a little confused by your answer, though. So I think I'm hearing you say, while you're troubled by it, the EU you don't see any indication that your colleagues in the Parliament will regulate the business model itself, but rather regulating aspects of the business model that we have lots of evidence could be human rights undermining. That was poorly phrased, but
exactly. So yeah,
okay.
Of course, I'm a little bit reluctant to go really and have a judge about different business models. Huh? But it has to be clear that fundamental rights and fundamental rules have to be respected.
Thank you. Okay, and next question is that, is there an expectation that the DSA and the DMA will allow EU tech startups to flourish and ultimately become big? Is that a direct objective or an indirect objective of these two?
So
legislation?
Can you repeat? There was a little bit.
Of course. Is there an expectation that the DSA and the DMA will allow EU tech startups to flourish and ultimately become big platforms?
I guess this is not in the mind of the Parliament, not at all. We want to transfer the analog legislation in the digital sphere without giving advantages to specific companies or ideas.
Thank you for that response. Okay, would you be willing to talk about Gaia X? And are you comfortable talking about that at all?
About?
Gaia X, the cloud platform Germany and France are creating based on the notion of, okay. Okay, along those lines, another guest asks about digital sovereignty. And this questioner wonders, what kind of sovereignty are you talking about? Are you talking about sovereignty for governments or sovereignty of the user? In other words, remember those, when you began your talk, Commissioner Lange, you talked about all the things that, the libertarian founders of Silicon Valley thought, and they said, governments have no role on the internet, but now we've seen governments must act, and that's your whole presentation. But many people are confused when you say sovereignty, what do you mean by sovereignty? And I don't mean you, but what does, for example, President Macron mean by digital sovereignty? Sovereignty for whom?
I guess 17 in our understanding is that systems are under democratic principles and under democratic control. So it is not autarky. That's a big difference. Even now regarding the crisis of supply chain, we are looking a little bit regarding resilience of supply chain and nearshoring. You in the United States built this CHIP Act with 15 billion investment. We have now a proposal for a European CHIP Act with an investment for 42 billion euro, so that the production can be increased and we have a more resilient in supply of semiconductor. I guess this is necessary to be sovereign in our industrial development, but we are not with this investment autark, and this is a big difference. So sovereignty means to have the possibility to develop under democratic control your own perspective, and this is, of course, crucial. You mentioned quite rightly, so that we are looking to some regulation by the Commission, by the member states, and some other authorities on a democratic basis, because this digital sphere is in other countries also used, and the question of biometric recognition and so on, not on a democratic basis. And therefore, we are quite keen not to allow these structures coming in European life. So sovereignty means democratic control of the development.
Thank you for that answer. Okay, if anybody has any more questions, please type them now. Meanwhile, I'll ask a question, which is, how does the EU anticipate? You know, right now we're all responding to the spillover effects of AI, right? We see the good, but we're, you know, trying to regulate those negative spillovers. But I don't see very many of us really anticipating spillovers. For example, 3D printing and how it might affect trade patterns, or immersive technologies and how they may, you know, stimulate a totally different approach to international affairs. Does the EU have a way to anticipate these?
Of course, we have some scientific bodies, and I'm totally convinced that we also need to anticipate the development and need to use the possibilities of AI and other innovative digital technologies. So I mentioned some minutes ago the due diligence legislation, so that we want to have a due diligence for companies in the whole supply chain. And so that there's no violation of labor rights and environmental standards and so on. I guess for a normal small and medium-sized business, it's totally not possible to have a clear vision if in a country X, a supplier Y is really fulfill the obligations. And therefore, to collect data of a country, of a specific supplier, and develop this data, I guess this is a duty of AI par excellence. Or to have transparency in the supply chain from the creator of a product to the dealer, this is really a blockchain technology foreseen. And this is also really reducing bureaucratic hurdles and burden. And therefore, yes, we should discuss and anticipate how we can use AI, what are the risks, no doubt about. But we have, specifically in Germany, this tradition of establishing research to discuss consequences of technology progress, Technologiefolgenabschätzung. And this we are doing with digital questions as well.
Thank you so much, Chairman Lange. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us and offer us these insights. And we hope to see you again in the United States when COVID is better. I mean, it seems like things are improving, but I guess we'll wait and see. And thank you so much to our audience. I just want to tell you of an upcoming event that we are doing. You probably notice I frequently mention immersive technology. And so the Hub is working with Chatham House and many other groups to have a conference on June 9th and 10th, which we hope will be in person, on how immersive technologies may change international affairs, institutions, and policies. And that will be free and open to all, and it will be immersive. So if you have any questions, please let us know. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. And again, thank you so much, Commissioner Chair Lange, and to our audience. Everybody have a great week.
Thanks a lot to you as well. All the best for you, and stay